relatively straightforward. My name's Ingrid.
Surya.
And we provocatively titled this session, Digital Literacy is a Trap, because we wanted to get people in the room and we thought that it would draw people in, but also we have concerns about digital literacy in general. And I guess, quick sort of like demographic check, because I guess I wanted to, basically just help, actually I'm realizing Melissa is not back yet, so be good if she can.
I'll go.
But I wanted to kind of get a sense of like, thought it might be useful to get a sense of where people are coming from, because basically what Surya and I have been doing some work that we'll talk a little bit about, creating sort of like teaching tools about networks and you know, network systems and infrastructural parts of the internet for young adults, and basically realized there are lots of people doing things in that space and we're not necessarily that great at all talking to each other, or maybe we're not great at talking to them, so we thought we'd try and get them to all come to us at a conference. And so getting an idea of maybe like where people are coming from, so maybe just show of hands, how many people here like I guess identify as educators or okay. Of that, like I guess anyone here like teaching kind of in like K through 12 environments? Okay, got a couple. Anyone like kind of in like the higher ed space? Both. All right, cool. Anyone here like kind of maybe working more in like a continuing education or like an alternative education after school, not straight curriculum kind of environment? Kind of, yeah, I guess Melissa, like, and how many would like say like where they're approaching like teaching this sort of material, like, or coming from like an arts or more like creative coding context? How many people are even just like as they approach like code at all are coming more from an art or creative coding context? It's just also good. And what were other inventory questions? Oh, one of them is actually just going to force two people to call themselves out, so I'm not going to do that to them. Then, okay, so that's helpful. It's kind of useful to get a sense of like the range of things people are kind of like looking at or working on. And I guess Surya and I have mostly been kind of coming from this, from more of a like the workshops we've been doing have been more in like an after school context, and we can talk a little bit more about them later, but we're kind of, I in some of the invites that I sent to some people here, I described us as like feral educators, like we're coming at this not necessarily from the standardized curriculum model, and like there are advantages and disadvantages to that. So the next thing maybe we could do is sort of like the popcorny discussion thing. I don't know, there might be too many people to do a full go around, but like maybe just sort of So we have we have some questions, I guess, that like were maybe about like getting a sense of so the other thing that's sort of weird, and I don't know if maybe you've experienced this, but like teaching like how the internet works, one is like sort of impossible, right? Like insofar as like I don't like there's like so many layers to what that sentence even means that you spend all their time just unpacking that. But two, like generationally, like I find that I'm in sort of a weird space where like the ways that I learned that stuff are very specific to like my context. So we want to see if anyone like kind of could like share like some experience of sort of like what was like a moment when like you learned about like networking, the internet, like or like kind of that made you actually like kind of care about this stuff or want to do more things with it. What were some of the like kind of aha moments? I mean, for me, like that was when I was 13 years old. I got really obsessed with a Flash game. And the forum community within it. And so for me, like there was a lot of it had to do with like being part of a particular subculture and finding a community that like I was into in that particular space. But that's not necessarily, does anyone have any like anecdotes they would like to share about their kind of like of like moment that kind of made them want to learn? Yeah.
Well, similar to you, like when I was adolescent, finding cheat codes for games, it's like pastime, and I wanted to play a game, and the only resource that I could find was on the internet, and I needed to find ways to get onto it in order to find what I needed.
And like, what did that kind of like lead you? Like, what was that? Where did that rabbit hole kind of take you? Like,
bypassing school firewalls and getting into programs where I shouldn't be opening, and just really obtuse strategies of using different networks.
Cool. Let's have a my first internet story.
For me, it's the first time I downloaded music, also mid-teen years, and it just, I mean, it sounds simple, but I was just blown away by the fact that I had a bunch of songs, and 3 songs, and it only took 20 minutes, and there was, all this whole, I could just get access all these things. I was like, oh, this is a thing.
Yeah, and that made you kind of want to know more about, like at what point did you kind of want to know more about how it worked, I guess?
Yeah, well, I grew up with computers, and I was making stuff on computers, but never making stuff for any kind of networked context until I was like 18. And that was like, because I was, so comfy with computers. I had a cousin who was in web development, and post.com boom, everything kind of crumbled, and he was trying to keep stuff alive, and part of that meant asking his cousin to maybe do some web development on the cheap in the back of his house, and he's like, hey, you want to learn how to do this stuff? And I was like, yeah, for money, but then that turned into serious passion. It was like, oh my god, I could make stuff on this space.
So child labor?
Yeah, it was all legal. But it was also in the back of a room of his house.
Okay, sure.
Are you looking at me?
It looked like you wanted to say something.
Okay, so it's 1995, and I was 42. So a little different age context, but a group of designers decided to collaborate. One person brought a modem. We were in Copenhagen, and all we could see out there was shopping. And we met with a group called the Mouse House. He would talk to us about democracy and web. This was all in the course of one weekend. And by the end of that weekend, we decided to develop the Green Map project using the internet, which none of us even had email at that moment. So it was like a watershed for a whole group that decided we would collaborate, and here's the means to do so. And it actually worked really well. And I was very fortunate to have a neighbor who was already a web designer, I'd meet her at 10 o'clock at night, and she would show me 1 or 2 things, like every night. And that was very cool. Good way to learn.
Okay, so that was kind of, any other anecdotal awkward things to throw out? No? Okay. I mean, I guess that was basically like the main point of asking that question and trying to get that was to get a sense of like, there hasn't been a standard way to teach this stuff, like, because it's all been kind of in development. And I think one of the things we were interested in getting people together for was because, or running a session at Radical Networks around is that it's getting, there is standardization insofar as there is like standardized like higher ed stuff, and it's getting more standardized in the K-12 environment. Like is it 2025 is when the CS for all NYC programs are supposed to like actually go into effect?
Well, they're going into effect now.
It's going into effect now, but the goal is
to
by
get to all schools by 2025.
Yeah, and so that's like there's a moment right now where it's like there's like curriculum being like very much like defined and standards for like what constitutes like digital literacy and like computer science literacy for young adults like becoming kind of more of an established sort of paradigm. And that's like none of the, like it's I don't like we kind of like I'm sorry I'm talking a lot. Do you want to?
No, I'm very happy to keep talking.
Okay. All right. I mean, it's really it's great to see like a growing kind of like public understanding that this is stuff that like kind of as more and more of like network systems kind of define the ways in which we live our lives, it's become like needing kind of better public comprehension. But I guess there's like, all approaches are gonna have like blind spots, and all approaches are gonna have a political agenda, whether they mean it to or not. And kind of having an absence of a political agenda is itself a bit of an agenda, you know? And I mean, I guess we're gonna just like, let's just be honest about our politics.
Yeah.
And we're totally happy to have people disagree or like talk about it. But I mean, I guess part of where we're coming from this is kind of a general skepticism at like code, like teaching code or teaching network systems or teaching like digital literacy kind of purely as an instrument of like job training or like consumer compliance, which is something that like, while like, I totally get wanting to do it and worry about kind of like what kind of like whether that kind of like perpetuates the systems that it's sort of trying to like respond to. Like if you like put more people in the pipeline but the pipes are still full of lead, like I don't know if like, things are gonna get that much better.
But also like in that context, also just thinking about how so much of what we even see in the news and how much we read about in terms of stories like the email, like LinkedIn's email leaks, like there's so much about understanding how those things work, which are related to protocols and technical things, which unless you are expected to have a certain sort of background in training, you don't really have access to. So a big part of this was like, how do you teach the internet as like a civics class instead of a coding class? So they were like engaging with it critically, so that when someone tells you this is how things work, you can kind of have some sort of like framework of questions to ask about it. Like, why is this how it works? Someone has decided for it to work like this, and stuff like that.
Yeah. I guess a lot of like the way that we've been approaching this, we initially started, so background I guess on where we're coming from, so my background is in art, Surya's background is electrical engineering, and then more computers. And we initially like started working together on stuff, teaching a class at the School for Poetic Computation, got a tiny grant from the Knight Foundation to try and work on some curriculum development stuff, and have been sort of continuing from there. A lot of what we've been doing has been about using kind of analog tools and focusing on kind of like, I guess, the bottom half of the OSI stack. And analog tools specifically because we were looking at like going into environments where either the internet was like not very good or just not very reliable, and also because a lot of this stuff like is very abstract and doing it on a screen actually isn't that helpful. So we'll show and tell moment.
Yeah.
So we brought some toys.
So I think before we talk about
Yeah.
we should talk about the first exercise
Oh,
the scene.
Yeah. So like I mean so a lot one of the is it rude for me to be sitting? Should I be okay.
I just took a chair. That's why I'm saying.
All right. I was worried that it made me seem like I was okay.
I'm sorry.
That's not bad.
Yeah, so a lot, like, one of the first things that we've been doing, like, in the workshops we've been running is, like, these activities where we kind of, like, ask, and we've been mainly working with, like, sort of, like, a 12 to 14-year-old age range. We picked that mainly because we're like, that's just old enough to start asking hard questions, but not necessarily, like, super attuned to, like, the shit's fucked up and bullshit narrative. Maybe we, it also that's kind of a starting point from which you can kind of build stuff where you can start to like kind of expand into that conversation. And so we'd start with them by like asking them to kind of first like do what we kind of made you do, which is like talk about like how do you like, well, how like you use the internet, what your relationship to the internet's already like, kind of how you think about it, and then
like, what do you think the internet looks like, and when you're going to like Google, so people don't tell us what they do, and they're like when you're going to Wikipedia, firstly like they're like even just what they said they do on the internet is I do Google. It's like what do you like about the internet Google? And it's like the kind of lack of thought around what we're actually doing was like an interesting starting point, and then asking them beyond that, like when you go to google.com, where are you going?
yeah,
Kind of
what do you think happens?
Yeah.
And then making them draw us a picture of how that worked, which I imagine a lot of you have like pulled that trick because like drawing pictures of the internet is always fun. And that's like kind of a good way to like kind of introduce, like also get a sense of like what is already in common knowledge. Like an assumption that seemed to be like universal is like was that like children generally seem to believe that the internet only moves through the air. There were lots of drawings of space, lots of satellites, lots of wireless systems, and that kind of makes sense because that's generally how they're interfacing with it, right? And then at that point, like another thing we would do is basically like take them, depending on the liability rules with the school, take them for like a walk around the block to show them bits of the internet immediately around them. So that would mean like showing them kind of like where utility markings were and like cell towers and stuff, and kind of explaining how those things fit into a larger thing. And once they'd sort of like seen certain pieces and we showed them other pictures of things like data centers and stuff, we had a kind of like topology modeling activity, which looks basically like this. So we had these sort of like, these sort of goofy little like blocks that have different sorts of like standardized, different sorts of like bits of the network that could like kind of communicate with each other, and sort of ask them to sort of figure out how you could put them together so that like someone on their phone could get a message from someone on a computer.
And that actually led to some really interesting conversations which I hadn't even thought about like how little the understanding was between the difference between data and your home Wi-Fi. Like people knew that one made their dad mad, the other was fine to use, but the context of why they were different was really interesting. And we actually like redesigned these to separate the kind of mobile phone network from like your other wireless network, just to give some sort of context.
Mobile phones are blue.
Yeah, I'll pass some of these around.
And yeah, wired connections are
So you guys can
Um,
these, there's some room there.
Yeah. And there were other sort of like stuff that activities we made. These are remnants from a packet switching relay race game. Inside all basically a bunch of like envelopes that have different like letters of the alphabet. I think it's just A, B, and C. Inside each envelope, jigsaw puzzle piece. The envelopes have to get moved by like teams from one side of the room to another. They're not allowed to see what, like they basically have to pick them up face down and like run them around the room, get them to the right like kind of like recipient who then has to put the puzzle together. And it's kind of it's one of those games that ends with being like, and the reason that computers do this is because they're fast, because that was harder for you to do. Which is usually still pretty fun.
Right, but also like when you start talking to students about the internet from beyond the browser, they actually, like most of them were pretty curious and had interesting questions to ask. Clearly there are parts of this which don't come up. Like one of the things that would always come up is how that interface with their school Wi-Fi network and how they can hide their Snapchats and not not have your like Facebook Messenger being read by other people, because they have these like ideas and I can do this, and when I do it, I'm doing it, but everyone can see it, and I don't know when they're seeing it. So there's this concept of surveillance is sort of there, but without any like technical understanding. And it's those mental models which I think like things like this help them like formulate questions around, at least to some extent, a lot, but
Yeah.
I think that was an interesting part of it.
Yeah. And I think like, there's like shortcomings, I guess, insofar as like, again, we've been doing this in a setting that's mostly like after school sort of like workshopping environments, which means self-selecting kids who already want to know this stuff. So like we have no idea if this is like going to be effective, whether this is effective to like any other kind of demographic than like pre-existing nerds. And maybe that's okay. But then also like, I don't know, I find like arguing for like the relevance of this material is really hard. Insofar as like, it's not as though like you kind of use this, like you do kind of like this analog activity and have a like comprehension. Like civics is not, isn't like easily instrumentalized. And so that's just, I don't know, that's maybe just sort of like a hanging question that we struggle with in terms of thinking about how to package this, how to like convince other educators that it's like interesting or useful to like what they're teaching. And there's more things, but I feel like it's already 10:55 and we have a lot of really good people here. I kind of wanted to like So workshop was a generous definition of this. Putting good people in a room was maybe the more genuine thing we were trying to do. So there were a few questions like that we thought might be good as sort of like ways to do sort of like facilitate discussion. And I guess, is this I'm not sure if is this too big a group to do like just one big conversation, or do you guys want to do like the table sort of have their own conversations?
Whatever you think will work best.
I mean, because I think we could then sort of have like a report backy thing if someone's willing to be a note taker. I see you're already addressing the questions. Thank you.
Not really, but I like playing with these. So.
Good. Great.
Should we split it up?
Yeah, I guess I'm gonna, because if from earlier when I asked for like the hand shows on like different kinds of experiences, if you're sitting near somebody who's coming from the exact same vantage point as you are, maybe one of you could switch tables so that you're not talking to people who are already kind of looking on the same problems as you. That would be cool, or I would like it. So I guess so the main questions, I guess, though, is I'm just gonna recommend starting things, and I can put these, or if we want to, one of the big pieces of paper, we can, for notes.
I think that's hard.
It is hard, but they need notes. Was basically like introductions, so like talking, maybe if everyone can just kind of talk about like sort of where they're approaching this topic, because it does seem like the majority of the room are people who are teaching or interested or working on education stuff. Like some of your particular sort of like interests, agendas, like, you know, what is it like your kind of like bigger picture concerns are? Things you've been doing that like seem to work really, really well, things that haven't, and sort of like obstacles and challenges that are sort of like big, hard questions that you're sort of dealing with. And I'll write these up on the board so you have them, but it's like 5 to 10 now. So if I give you guys like 15 minutes and then do a check-in, does that sound okay? And technically I think there's nothing in here after 11:25, so we could probably stay later if we wanted. But there's another really good talk happening at 11:25, so no one has to stay put. We're good? And then if someone could please volunteer to take notes during the session, that would be excellent. All right, 1, 2, 3, break. Go.
Yeah, what are those?
Representations and
Programming stuff, like around and teach people new stuff all the time.
Sure, that's
I'm Melissa, I'm a public librarian. I work at the public library. My name is Beth. I'm a student at I'm also a student at IT. I also do education research at Pedagogy.
My name is Monty, I'm the programmer.
An artist and an educator based in Chicago.
Brandon, I'm also based in Chicago, and I'm an artist programmer.
Gary, technical chess designer, Toronto Mesh. My team.
I'm Lee. I'm Lee Sussman. I'm an artist, curator, and programmer. I'm a grad student at UCLA's EMA program, Design Media Arts. And I run Hackerspaces, an alternative nonprofit arts organization.
I'm Jane, and I'm living in Kepner, I'm lurking. I work for the Internet Society doing internet infrastructure development, development issues.
Yeah, okay, now.
So I think, if I'm understanding, what we're trying to do is kind of list things about shared concerns.
The most embarrassing story.
That we think about. Is that right? Is that how we started?
Teaching a private school.
Cool.
Where we do tech, that's a starting
And it would be interesting to hear, a bunch of us are educators, as well as artists, and it's also interesting, some of you, I think, but I understood what you're saying, are more like researchers maybe, or, and so that would be kind of interesting to hear maybe too.
Sure, people that would love to have them hear from.
I'm bad at kicking things
Think
off.
of it also as a broader.
I can share an agenda. All my work, both as an artist and an educator, are motivated by the same agenda.
Nothing more like.
keep that in check when in certain educational contexts, institutional growth and stuff. In a nutshell, I generally get more and more worried as certain technologies take over every aspect of our lives, how little people understand it, and just seeing the way that things go down, the way that it's discussed, it just feels like so much agency is being removed day by day from regular people. They understand they're like cars better than I understand the computers, but computers. So that's kind of the main motivation, is trying to get people to be able to have that conversation.
Works together with and about sexual strangers, including me, to a certain degree. So I'm very interested.
Who else is there? I'm Tom. I teach at NYU as well. I'm with the Communications program. I run an area of the course called physical computing, where we think about the physical reality of dealing with computers or when to change those cases. And I also teach about networking. Trying to do basically exactly what we're talking about here, get people broader popular imagination for the internet as a market, as an industry, as a medium, as politics, as advice, as geography. All of these very
So, I'm Nick. I'm an artist who works for technology, but just as much, I'm also a technician who works with artists. So it's a bit of both. I work mainly with sort of sound and live installation, but also internet-driven things. And I wouldn't say I'm a coder, I'm probably more a hacker and a cutter and paster. But yeah, I of course work with people who do coding and that's an interesting to achieve what I want to achieve if I can't do it.
I think that's a really interesting tension that we also see come up a lot, which is that people who kind of think about this stuff a lot, like a lot of people in this room, they kind of like highlight these like nuances or the things that are like pressures and shows more like often not started. And it's this which I think is sometimes really hard to kind of overcome, because the file stuff, but really this is like, if you learn how HTTP works, it kind of all of this will make sense, and I don't care. Just like download this file. And how do we like form, how do you force it in that system? You learn something new about, feel empowered, but you also learn something along with it. I think it's an interesting challenge in terms of space.
I have an interest coming from, my background is like an artist before getting into programming. But always being involved in education, I have, one thing that happened is as I learned to program myself, it unlocked a different way of like a different form of self-education, right? So for a very long time, I was hitting roadblocks. This is in high school. Maybe, during college, I studied sociology and art and arts history and music production, right? But then afterwards, I got interested in this again, but I kept like kind of, here's Python, I can't get it. Here's this thing, can't do it. When I was younger, I think it was basic, but I was a kid in Pascal. And then at some point, I don't know, it's like mid-late 20s, and like kind of picked up some book. I think I found like Dan Schiffman, right? There's like a few of these different things. And then I like got far enough that I was like, things were making sense. They were like adding together. And at some point I realized like I could kind of learn anything. I couldn't explain how, but using what I had, come together and like added up in my head, I could actually now basically self-teach myself anything. But then I started looking for networks of other people that had this kind of shared knowledge too, and we kind of teach each other too. And I think one of my goals as an educator is often, I'm kind of maybe connecting it back to these basics things. Like I think that is more advanced than these very basic things, but for me they go together, which is like if you can get to, I can't even explain what it is, but if you can get to some kind of level of knowledge where things start piecing together, you kind of, for me at least, I think this is true for other people, it starts to let you kind of remap your own education and your own, that turned into the empowerment thing. It's like, oh, okay, I don't know how to do a bunch of stuff, but I know that I will be able to figure it out or find the resources. And that's kind of my goal, I think, of an educator, is to get people to that level. But again, I have trouble describing what that is even.
Yeah, that's actually been sometimes one of the more.
Yeah, it's like really similar to the whole notion of like I can teach myself anything is also, I mean, from an arts perspective,
Right.
similar to like I can make anything.
Right.
You know, like that's also been like that was like a point that I had too when I hit a certain level of literacy and programming, where I realized these things I've seen on the screen, I can now kind of imagine how they were made. And I have this feeling of like, now I can just come up with things, figure out how to do them and do them. I'm no longer like, nothing seems unattainable, you know, within like the realm of like a screen or something. Like I can do anything on this screen that I can imagine. That's also tied to this kind of selling point, at least for artists. It's one of the, I mean, the question you brought up changes based on the audience, you know, whether it's younger kids or adults, or but in like the context of art school, I try to make that a selling point of like you can just, all these things that you imagined and maybe have seemed out of reach, you learn these tools and they're in reach.
Right.
And then through that, also sneak in politics and all this. Like as while we're learning, might as well let's talk about why this ended up this way and who's affecting these things, and take that into account as you decide, once you decide to make stuff with this, all these tools.
Nick, you're an interesting example too, because there's your artwork, and then you also spend a lot of time, I imagine, to make resources available online. You link to a lot of information, you break things down by category, you have your own tutorials and introductions. Like I've used your resources a lot, right? And I send it to other people too. And I think that's also an interesting model, because it's a different, it's like not teaching within a classroom necessarily, although I know that, I believe that's your experience too.
Yeah.
But this other thing of like actually creating resources for online community
I'm AT&T.
that has that kind of farming tentacles too. I think that's also really
You don't charge
interesting
me
model
to
to follow
outgoing
as well.
traffic from my.
Well, I mean, I think that was a real.
So these peering agreements are essentially how they arrange for traverse
Right,
across the.
right.
It just seems like a waste sticking all this knowledge in.
And I've never known, and I think Jane maybe some has, but I've never known how they go about those negotiations.
Right.
That's a question.
traffic laws that adults who already have jobs and have so many things to do. They don't have the drive and the motivation.
Well, I'm sure they're private meetings, but I'm sure that the person,
And then how do you make that
proceedings
fair?
are probably
So
similar.
I think that becomes my point from people who already are.
Sure, they have a bunch of analysts and lawyers and stuff to get together and negotiate terms.
It's much more challenging for.
But even the fact that we're sitting here talking about it as they,
Yeah.
gives us a point of beginning research, or another point of research. Right? So it's like, I've always assumed that X, maybe I should go find out. And
I think another, as well as looking at the structure from above, this top-down view, I think it's really important to also look at the sideways entries, maybe for want of a better term, of just what am I sending here? What is an email? What is that as opposed to a physical? What's the makeup of it as opposed to a message in an envelope? It's a packet with a header, and where does it go? And let's trace that packet and let's ping, and then we can see, it's going to pop there to there. I think this is also a very important entry level for people to sort of understand.
So one of the other questions I always come up against when thinking about this stuff is like this kind of this general trend that we have towards like abstracting things and hiding the complexity for the end user. Right? How we're slowly like transitioning from like skeuomorphic design to more like kind of like flat design. So things don't look like things which have references to stuff in your life. We're kind of getting used to this idea that computers are like this or whatever. So when we come up with trying to teach about this, we started way like kind of more technical and like, oh yeah, we give them this browser, we give the kids these like browser things and show them how to like poke around with this stuff and all of these things. And it gets really hard because with HTTPS and like the way you like minify JavaScript and all this nonsense now, there's no easy way to really show people like to poke around. You can do some stuff like you can still do like HTML manipulation. There's some like stuff that's but like that really giving the concept of like who is the person who decided this looks like that and like this looks like this, and when I go here, who is sending it? Like, where is it coming from?
And
that
as you may
is,
be able
it's
to
such a
imagine,
big
Australia,
like production now, that I think like that's something that gets really hard to explain, and I'm just curious if you guys have any
but it was promised
kind
for
of
everyone in
insights into
Australia.
thinking out into like how like metaphors or examples or things that like
farm
help
with thousands of miles
explain to
away from
people
anyone.
like some concept that you're trying to
Yeah, so
explain to
you know,
them
you
in
can
this
imagine
space.
that why they wanted to stop it because of the cost of this. But
I'll say that physical
at the
objects
time, the
are
interesting
kind of
thing was
direct
just how many
information that
of
I
these
got to
politicians who were
self-worker
discussing
training.
this topic
We have a
no
workshop
real
at Toronto
idea
Match that
of
involves
what
yarn,
the difference
and
was.
people
All
like
these
connect
people
each other.
coming
We
to
try to
Parliament
create
to
robust systems,
tell them
very
why
rudimentary
farmers
ways of
were
representing
copper,
edges and ends.
you
So
know, the
I think
old
that's
copper
a
phone
possibility.
network and
But
this
I
sort of
wonder
stuff.
if there are other
So it's, you know,
strategies.
the people who were making decisions about the internet politics actually had no idea really about that was sort of just
In the
something
recent digital privacy trainings that I worked on with, it was research action design, RAD.
Anybody teaching politicians?
Yeah, so we hired them to
There's
work
no
with
curriculum in that area.
but since the focus was privacy, you know, we talked about HTTP. Yeah, so there was this exercise that was like, here's a postcard, like, look, it says, you know, to so-and-so from so-and-so, and then it was, you know, like, let's pass it around, like, you're the router.
It's another channel for
Like,
like building.
it was, and then, you know, like, let's put it in an envelope, and then, you know, what can this entity along the path see?
In terms of
And
actually
it
like
was,
explaining tech.
in the workshop where I saw it, it was a little less helpful because people were still sitting where they were sitting, so it was sort of like, you know, like everybody in the room can see it, you know, it was, but then to stage it in this sort of way may have been more disruptive, so I would say that was a semi-successful thing. And actually, just because, in case anybody's curious, this was, I mean, this is not like a clever metaphorical thing, but we made this, like, these data flow things, like when you visit a website, what is it? Because even among librarians, when we asked them to, you know, map out, like, what happens when you send an email or try to browse a website, you know, sometimes the librarians would be like, well, it's in the browser, you know, where did it come from? Like, it's in your browser, like, it just appears, which I think is unhelpful, and I think that's a really good point about, you know, people think of this, like, you know, not even next level, but like everybody should know that code, like this is a very important part of literacy and being, you know, a functioning citizen, you know, which can't possibly be true, like everybody is not going to be a full coder, but I think just, yeah, understanding what code does is part of it, because I mean, I'm not a mathematician, I try to understand enough to know what I don't know and what maybe, you know, like, but yeah, not everybody has that aptitude or has that leisure time. And that has to be okay, but yeah, what is the base level for
I think,
everybody?
I always think about like, where does this look like in terms of like a more like structured policy kind of space? Because like, yeah, when people make bridges, everyone doesn't need to know how a bridge works, you just trust that the civil engineers are like made it. My favorite examples actually was like sanitation grades at restaurants.
maybe that's the
So like it's like this idea that like when you go to a restaurant and you see a sanitation grade, even though you have no idea what like that means, but if you see a C and you get like food poisoning, you probably like kind of take some of the blame. But if you see an A, you probably be more mad because even though you don't understand like what the thing is, that abstraction of like grade was something you got to make a choice in. So I keep thinking of like what are places in which we can give people like a space for choice. So like again, like HTTPS as an extension that you can download, force your things to be private. The problem is a lot of these things don't give you case study model. So just thinking again, in these spaces, I like
often we're talking
totally
about
agree with you
stuff
guys. I think code is important, but it's not the only problem. I think like if everyone was a coder, it wouldn't mean that these problems would go away.
Stand back and just look at how.
And I try to look for like references in the back in the past, and I struggle with it. But like what are other models of things that have had tried to break the paradigm of what exists? So, like the tobacco industry is one that I think about, right? Where like when they were like trying to fight for policy, saying that like cigarettes were not that bad. Like how like who were the agencies that were trying to fight that? Because a lot of it is I think at that level too. So I think about like all these layers in which we're empowering.
We had like at the end of the workshop, we asked like
who are you up against in that context? And I think this is something that gets confusing with the
like, how is this different from how you thought it worked, questions, kind of to gauge how much they kind of like actually absorbed, and then also we asked them like what else they wanted to know, and a lot of them had history questions, like where did it come from? And I don't actually know where that gets taught in the K through 12 framework, because like in some ways it's tricky, because like computer history and internet history are quietly interwoven into all of the other histories, and in a lot of different ways. But placing it into like, but there is like, I mean, when we're looking at a lot of
structure that is so personal.
like I've been looking at a lot at sort of
that's
like
the,
how
that's the other
CS
thing
rules
that's
stuff,
so
like it's
confusing
how
about
the
it.
rubrics are
Is that
like,
we
yeah.
we are all like it's
History
my
doesn't
Facebook
quite
account.
have
It's my
a space in it other than if
it's
you
not,
could like
it's not the city's
build a
brain.
cool thing that
It's
you
my
could look at
I
it.
think that's something that really confuses me.
But that's,
There's also a sequencing problem too, right?
Because you can explain this stuff
cards
as
on the
like
table,
lots and
my
lines
wife
and
is
lots,
on
but
teachers,
it doesn't fit into your lived
and one of the
experience
things
of
that she
it.
constantly reminds me
And
is
that tension, I think, is something that's also.
there are things I need to
I guess a
teach
lot
them
of people
before
don't
they
relate to
teach them.
that because they don't really grasp the gravity of how important this is.
In the case of
And
what
they
we're
come from
talking
the
about,
mentality
she's
of,
in the middle right
but I
now.
have nothing to hide, but everybody does. And I hear that a lot every day,
There's
like, but I
all
don't
kinds of
have
fascinating topics to teach around that, especially
actually,
in an age of
first of all, that's not the point. And second of all,
You know,
I
and
think you do,
yet,
and it's okay.
does she put that
And I
side
think
to
so,
say,
like,
I don't know.
showing people that
But,
urgency
I think back to the
that
bigger question
this
of all
stuff
this,
matters
is if we look at this
could
as
motivate
a,
them, I think.
an
Like,
ongoing
it matters if we
lifelong
don't get, like, not getting
thing
food
to
poisoning
learn.
matters, right? So
then
we look at the
sequencing
brain
it and how you
means
sequence
something
it
to us.
for different
It's an
groups,
abstraction,
different
it's an
communities.
icon. And so I think
Part of
people
this
who don't have time
thing-
and who don't have the motivation, I think that can potentially create the
What do
motivation
you know already?
to start caring
Okay.
about that stuff.
What is it of value to me to teach you
This is mostly my
now?
tactic, and
How is it gonna change your
the reason I started to feel like
practice
doing
or
this as well,
perspective?
we're like
So
we're
being able to have a
essentially
grab bag
scaring
of
people
different
into
ways
caring.
of doing that,
It
at
was
least is my strategy to
the
it.
folks ever download Fire Sheet when that existed, this browser program. So Fire Sheet I just feel like is there's a period in recent internet history where
Do you
nobody was
guys, because I'm
encrypting
not
their
from
session cookies.
US,
And after you logged in to your account, somebody could grab the session cookie, look it up, and
my knowledge base.
I mean, this was,
Do you
people,
have,
I mean,
like, do the
Facebook wasn't
kids
doing it, Google
get
wasn't doing it,
information
Facebook wasn't doing it,
sciences
Yahoo
in
wasn't doing
class,
it,
like,
Twitter wasn't doing
right.
it. So if you were in a cafe and you were sign up for those cookies, you'd grab it,
Yeah, because I think
go
it's
onto
becoming
Facebook,
more
and
and
you're
more
automatically
important
into that account. And
That's good.
people,
It's
it's
good.
communities
Yeah.
on the side that
Okay.
none of these
We're trying to
shared enough to, it's one of these like, yeah, but nobody knows how any of this works, so who cares?
Yeah.
So you guys can do it. And then we made a browser plugin that just made it really easy to grab the session cookies, making it a requirement. So it's like, awesome, this opportunity, you know, people have this response, and you're like, cool, so you approach it a lot wrong, and then people do.
being able to make something because networks is really important to make it.
Then I stopped
We
thinking,
approach it
like,
constructivism.
like, because now I realized that
Children are
I've
sort
been
of
adding to
building
this,
up
the
their
fear
knowledge
narrative, the
about
sort of like
this
doom
stuff
and gloom,
in order to
and so
access
often,
questions
and
and
like,
these
like,
girl asking,
it
like,
triggers that
Yeah.
interest
Yeah.
only probably
in that initial
after she's
conversation.
done.
Yeah.
It's like
Yeah.
this where it
And now
suddenly
you have some agents, and you just
Yeah.
define it to like, oh yeah,
they've
these
sort
are
of
really
built
screwed up right now,
knowledge
and
in their head
and you're like, well,
experience that you touch
just
it.
let's, you know, Google has my best interest.
You know, yeah, so it goes back to sequences. I think if you subscribe to the constructive
And I'm not an answer to that, I just feel like I have another.
Consensus
for conceptual specific history.
I wonder if some of that has to do with the fact that at least historically we're seeing in a period, at least
Lack of control.
in the US right now, that is anti-science but pro-engineering. And that's a weird combination,
Those things are
but
present
very true.
on Google for.
So we tend to go constructivist because we're like, we'll show you how to do it. We won't talk about
It's
what.
where you start,
Yeah.
much like how using email and getting to your Gmail to get an attachment like that. You sending data to models or like that. You don't have like direct access to that here to begin with.
To make the internet a different
You
thing.
lose control of that.
What's the goal of
Where things kind of start.
if civics is the model, like you want people to make conscious choices and
I don't know, that's like
that help the country move
that.
forward. I guess it's
That's a
sort of,
plugin.
you know, history teachers would probably say, right?
Thank
You have a good understanding of history, so you understand where you want.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think those are sort of tied
I think
together.
kids do that about the
Lack of agency, lack of control over your
Well,
personal
no,
systems
but they try and
and then
decide
just
like
lack of
what
understanding of
kinds of
what's
things they
at
want to
risk
do.
like that.
Like, so one thing,
Nothing to hide.
one of the things
Always
that's also
come
like
from
a
a
big
position of
influence
like
of
not
it,
really
about this stuff is
understanding
years ago I was at this like
the situation.
education
quick
conference,
response,
kind of by
I
accident,
said
and
this,
was going to talk about like the history of MIT and like the failure to like integrate ethics into like curriculum and science. It's like it's not happening in like the undergrad CS level. Where do you even put it? And joking this morning, like trying to figure out like if Mark Zuckerberg like had like stayed in college long enough to take one class about colonialism, would he have like really been like internet.org? That's a great
I don't
idea.
care about freedom of speech because you have nothing
Probably
to say.
yes, because he's
a tweet from this morning.
I was Googling.
I've actually found the only place I have
Just trying to figure out if
successfully
he
been able
random.
to explain something technical to someone and have them change their behavior was with Wi-Fi. Because that was the one place where it was really easy, where you could like show them so that you turn on your Wi-Fi, you know how you automatically connect to a network, your phone is shouting out these names of networks you connect to. You can show them those networks that they have connected to in the past, that they're surprised their phone is
But so
connected.
the point being,
And then they will
yeah,
turn it off.
the
And since I've done that, I've been looking for like something, I'm like, oh, I'll just do everything like this. And I think like that's why I get to understand the question of abstraction and complexity in the products.
But explain that explicitly.
It's so hard to
like
give that feedback. But I do think there's somewhere in between the doom and gloom and the like complete liberation conversation is this thing of like how do we let people have like a tactile response to this themselves where they have some sandbox environment where they can poke around and see for themselves. But it's really hard to do that in the context of how they use the internet day to day. Because the complexity of that is beyond what we so like what is the lowest level? So I tend to like so currently I'm trying to like make like a Wireshark tool, but with the Wireshark tool I'm trying to make a server that in its metadata it's like tutorial information. So when you're seeing the packets come in over the network, they're actually explaining to you what they're doing. Even though that's no work, but it's just these ideas like what are the parts of it that we need to, what are the things that make you detective? It's kind of like, because that actually I found really helpful in the metadata conversation. Where it's like, oh, so they know when I got under the so that means that they can figure out the, and it's like, it's not technical, it's not complicated, but it's powerful.
The idea of like setting, like trying to
Yeah, I think we've entered an era of product design for the web, especially that a lot of the views can throw a lot of people off. Clean design, check marks, locks, things like that. There's actually really product design, and it's like, oh, perceived security of the system is this and that. I was like, there's another way of thinking about it, not as a designer, but as a consumer, who sees this checkbox that's like a lock that's behind it, and I'm like, don't worry about it. There are like talented genius engineers behind this site, right? So they're like, I'm hoping that they're gonna have like this interest, right? And so there was a time where we would like put together like really broken, false, like badly put together HTML, but we did when we built pages for ourselves.
Teach me something kind of useful, maybe.
QCs and whatever. That's how I started early on, right? And that's how I started like feeling like I can have some sort of agency, but like now we have like Squarespace, which is doing it. I actually love their product. I think it's great. I used to make a lot of portfolio websites for my artist friends, and that's how I got into like making more websites. But I think they're doing a great job. But it's at the same time, it's like quick and easy, drag and drop, whatever. Instead of like abstract. You're removing people from, you know, the kind of like guts of the thing they're making. And we're here, and I don't actually feel like we have an answer to how we, you know, get back into the guts of it. They don't need to, and I think it's beautiful that we can work with abstractions because it makes life easier. But at the same time, all those like lock icons and green checkboxes and things like that sort of translate into that A level grade. I think we think about it that way, but it's not really. So that's the barrier of entry. You know, like I personally see. You know, that HTTPS icon on my Chrome browser, and I'm like, okay, cool, I'm good to go. And I'm like, okay, but I'm like really thinking about everything. And even as a programmer, it gets to me. I don't have an answer. It's more like a line of inquiry.
That's the group that decides this is how the rules will be enforced or will be enacted.
I used to for a long time.
maybe the next question up
that,
is,
like, those kinds of abstractions from, like, it's
where does,
mystifies the whole thing.
who is the
and
legislative branch of your
obscures the whole
IT
thing.
staff?
But, you know, like, the histories where all that came from was really about bridging, like, making this, all of this easier for people to understand, all that original research. And so it's like, it can do both those things, and then I came across,
And understanding that
yeah, exactly, yeah.
already given
Learnable programming, in particular, is key. Kind of hard to just work on the middle ground, where it's like you're learning, and this is specific towards the aim of, for him, it's actually he wants to reinvent programming. But you could also think about it in terms of how to teach programming, but you could also think about how to teach digital literacy. So it's back to this idea of, let's have an icon, now we're hiding things, show the thing, now we're freaking them out, and we understand like the argument for designing those two.
It's easier as
having
engineering major
these interfaces and abilities in the design just kind of augments some of the stuff that's happening in the background. You kind of choose how to interface. You kind of choose to interface with either side. And if you choose the friendlier interface, this kind of stuff that's happening on the it kind of helps.
Is there another approach
that you mentioned art?
Because you want inclusion and for things not to be arcane, and that the only people you can have a personalized web presence are people, are programming wizards or have access to that. But yeah, I mean, because it is like the nature of feeling disempowered, that things are just a black box. You don't know how it works, you don't know who makes decisions about it. You don't know where it's located. I mean, that's like Ingrid's works on the physicality of the internet.
I still haven't finished developing that.
So 5 more minutes, guys, and then we like kind of do
The turning point
sync up.
was when I realized.
I also wanted to touch up on something, I don't even know how relevant this is, but it's text solutionism. So a lot of times,
And I realized how much it was.
I come across people who are like, and we're gonna teach them how to, fish in the digital age and it's gonna solve the problems and poverty and whatever. And that's not really, like without the social, political infrastructure and the understanding
And so that's why Google.
of why these things are the way they are, they can't really do much.
And I think that's a really interesting, because another line of inquiry and how that is important in this is very hard. What do we decouple in terms of like, because I totally agree with the kind of the angle of like agency and like kind of coding your way through learning how stuff works and breaking it. But I don't think that is necessarily going to help the larger kind of policy level questions around like privacy and data ownership and these issues. So like where, like that's another thing that I find really hard to like figure out what the boundaries are, but what are the things that like people like EFF should have more empowerment with, and where can we, what are the kind of agendas we should be putting at a high scale to the government saying that these should be our rights as citizens, blah blah blah, in the digital space, because EFF is the closest example I can think of the people who do that, but we don't really have a strong like post-Archworks and like so I don't think we've actually had that kind of like rallying of the troops in the same way around this stuff. And I think a big reason is because it's hard to know what to even after, but figuring that out is I think another interesting.
And I think there's a lot of parallels here.
That's what I was getting at, yeah.
Well,
I think
for me,
that
the agency/literacy is, I mean,
somebody's got to be
kind of the same as a prerequisite for having this conversation. Because like, again, like the privacy thing, people's responses
it's
are,
sort of like
and that was
you
around. And that's one of the reasons I love this book, literacy, right?
And it might be easier for people to
Literacy, you learn to read and write, doesn't mean you're a poet.
Yeah, but you can't talk about it
actually
unless you've got
function in
policy in
society.
place to allow it.
You know, you can read the laws and decide whether you agree with them or not.
Or you can talk about it.
And it's like,
And it's really new, so, and
everyone should
a
learn
lot
to
of
code, it's
the
just
focus
that.
right now
It's
is
not
on
to
affordable
become a
housing,
programmer.
moving
It's
the
just so that you
affordable
can
co-ops.
live.
But I think there's one more angle to that, which is it's not just that you can
It's very
program,
interesting
it's not that you
that
can
you're
do that,
starting
you
to
can
look
think
at already
Exactly, yeah.
collaborate.
Because the thing about programming is
I think
when
this
you
is
learn
some
to
very nice
program, it's like, if you didn't have certain sort of critical systems thinking, that if you didn't acquire that through some other means, this is definitely a means of acquiring that. And like, you need that kind of thinking to even understand how any of this stuff works.
The other thing,
Or even to be able to imagine how they work. And once you have that, you can see the system and kind of be like, oh, I can kind of guess how this might be working. And then you know to ask the questions of like, oh, that better be secure because otherwise, there's that being,
feeling kind of like I
does that
know a
have
lot of
this,
people
is
from in vacuums kind of doing this stuff, and
but But
maybe that's just
it's
like,
that kind of conversation that
like
would,
figure out how to
we would
get,
need to have
what's
this
a
kind
good way to kind
of
of keep
larger than EFF sort of rally
these,
call.
like,
People would be like, also
things
you guys
better
aren't
for
addressing
each
this
other,
thing.
or
There's this
I don't know
whole
how many
portion of the
people actually
population that
want
maybe
to
weren't as represented in the EFF combos because they're small group and want to do so much, but then are
Yeah,
like,
if there's
we want to throw this in the agenda too,
what
because
sort
this
of
is
like,
important to us.
and also like, what would be
We now
useful, like,
realize
because
it.
what's, I don't know if this was useful.
Yeah, I think a lot of
I
the,
found it very interesting and
engineering
informative,
and
but like in terms of things that we want for the
approaches
like
where you're
things you're
production
working on or
perspective,
how you're taking
or
it.
like programming coding is like for making something.
Would it be
right?
good to
And
be
that's
able to
because
keep checking
people who
in
do
with
teach
that
or
there's
fund
no
those kind of teaching programs benefit
and what would be
from
like a
that
preferred
kind of
vehicle for
approach.
doing that?
And I think that kind of really abstracts what it kind of is building upon. And I think like even almost, I like to think of like learning code, and as you mentioned, like literacy of the language, as like learning not to read, not to understand completely, but to like a law. Like you understand the language, you not understand every single part of the law, but just kind of gives you a better idea of how that code is actually affecting the infrastructure. And I think that's another important point too, which is that a lot of times we just kind of think that the whole infrastructure is kind of being built on a clean slate, but it's actually kind of adding on top of the existing world infrastructure, and how that is really being impacted is being abstracted in the process.
Okay, this is this concept.
So we might think on like the lines of like Amazon and just here in France and all that, but how is the actual code and the abstraction all that affecting the actual thing on the ground, like just from the supply chain management to logistics and all that, and how kind of code politicizes all of that.
The CSTA is a good, it's a different question.
All right, I think we should start
The audience is what I was looking for is computer science teachers, and they gather every summer, next one's in Baltimore. Yeah, you actually decide the deadline for proposals. So
Yeah.
if you have an hour, it doesn't take that long to make one, but sometimes having those types of deadlines helps you kind of refine your thoughts. So, that audience, which comes nationally, I think, is hungry for mission-based computer science, not just the CS for all. Like, you know, there's what's the ethics, what's the morals of the situation. I think that would be a great venue to talk to a lot of people outside of the bubble we're here.
Yeah. Well, so the thing is, like, even the bubble, like,
You know to ask.
a conference that calls itself radical that works. Like,
Yes.
you're gonna get a self-selecting group of like people with particular.
Yeah, unless you have people walking out after you open your mouth, it's like
Yeah.
too much of a vibe.
Actually, it'd be interesting to rename conservative networks next time, to see how the audience changes. And get some conversations going.
The old.
I'm also interested
Topic networks.
in all ages learning. You know, for many people, the internet, they are kids, they're brand new to it. So to think they're, be more inclusive about who we think about our sphere.
I think we're gonna try and bring it back. Okay. So it's like 11:30, and technically, I don't think there's anything in here again until 1, but 1, there's another talk going on, and if anyone wanted to go to that, I didn't want to like keep them. And also, I think that lunch is at noon, so maybe I wanted to guess if like people could like wanted to share some of the insights that they found useful at their respective tables with the other tables. That would be cool. Bueller?
You guys want to go first, since I gave you more prep time?
So what we talked a lot about was.
I just want to say that the talk coming is Jane Coffin, talking about, setting up infrastructure in awkward places, so it's worth watching.
Yeah, it's very relevant.
Yeah, this conversation.
So, yeah. Thank you.
We talked a lot about point of entry and how to make these issues relevant to the people that we're trying to teach. So one thing that came up was showing people the urgency of these issues and how you keep from scaring them and making sure that they still feel empowered at the end of that interaction. Yeah, we talked a lot about abstraction and how emerging technology is increasingly abstracting what is happening behind the scenes. So you have the benefit of increased usability and potentially increased access, but people are less aware of what's going on. And whether you really need that, like how much trust you have in civic systems and the designer behind those structures. And then also being critical of tech solutionism. So helping people code isn't necessarily going to solve these like larger policy questions. I'm sure I'm missing things that people should.
Does anyone else want to add anything, or I think this would be a good company for last thoughts, feelings, comments?
The conversation was definitely more about challenges, I think, than the what works.
Yeah. Hope something works.
People did come up with a few different exercises that they tried at their own workshops. Let's see. Oh, I noted the one with the yarn and also the postcard. So like showing how edges work, or edges and nodes, and also how
HTTP versus HTTPS. Network transmission.
Yeah, like a postcard metaphor. Sorry.
Talked about a lot of
we invited
things.
you here because you're
We talked about looking at the internet from a lot of different angles. We had a lot of, the thing that came up for me a lot was this idea of negotiation. I think you brought it up originally. You talked about it in terms of power structures. We talked about trying to get people to understand that the internet is a negotiation, from its technical levels to its political levels to its business levels. Pierre brought up teaching other networks. We talked briefly at the end a little bit about electrical networks and how that's similar in that structure. And I'd love to hear from people about other networks they teach even so. We talked about who our constituencies are, or our stakeholders, and who we teach, and how their backgrounds and their skills and their needs differ, and how that changes how we sequence or how we introduce material. What else did we talk about?
One thing you said that I liked about culture that is anti-science but pro-engineering.
Oh yeah, we said that came out of my mouth somehow or other. What were you saying here?
The need for prerequisites. How much can you actually teach about networks if you don't have?
Oh yeah. Essentially, how much do you, before you can teach something about a network, there's a certain level of pre-knowledge people need to have. We get excited about teaching these things at lower and lower levels, but maybe it's irrelevant before the kids understand some of the stuff that comes before that, or the adults, as Wendy pointed out, understand some of the stuff before that.
And where does ethics come into play?
Yep, that was a big topic
Yeah.
as well. That all of the practice of making the internet and using the internet is a deeply ethical one. I think Ingrid pointed out that it was missing in CS in engineering at MIT in general at one point, and how central it is to make that part of your practice in teaching this stuff. I'm looking around at the pieces of paper to see what else we got that's really useful. Anything severe? No.
The connection between networks and maybe power grids, and how one teaching branch can actually learn from the language and the issues at stake in other.
And we talked about how that, again, is as much a political thing as a technical thing, and how much of power grids dynamics changing has to do with policy around it, economic and governmental policy around how power is distributed. Wendy brought up the fact that you can be a small-scale power producer in the U.S. in New York now, and I mentioned that got me fascinated, because if you imagine a smart grid as a network where I can sell power back to the grid and nobody knows the difference in size between me and Con Ed, it's not that different than me running my blog and nobody knowing the difference between me and NBC in a sense. I guess on the internet nobody knows that you're a small power producer.
And one more thing I
Yeah.
thought that was very important, that you can also learn what networks are from networks that are not your own country. So talking about Tasmania or is it
The
Nicaragua?
Seychelles guys.
Using case studies.
Yeah, case studies not from Western or like this cluster of tier 1 providers, I guess, maybe
Mhm.
somehow. Yeah.
Cool. So the thing that I started asking this table, and I guess was going to use like, so part of the other thing like we want to do is also just like give you a awareness like talking to each other, and then like also like maybe make it possible for you to keep talking to each other if you want. No one really wants to be on another mailing list, but if people wanting to be, like if there were connections here that seemed useful, or like there were people you or wanted to kind of like be kept, like be able to like check in with other teachers who are doing stuff in this space, if that's something people want to do with the people here and or others, like we are interested in setting up a means for doing that. So I guess maybe if people want to, I think if you registered for the workshop, I can get your contact information, but if you just want to give me the best contact information for you, I can take it down and follow up. But there are other like channels, I mean, there are other groups and organizations, and did you want to put in that plug for that open call, or that call for?
Oh yeah, if you want an audience that would be hungry for this, the Computer Science Teachers Association, which brings together computer science teachers all over the country, they're meeting next summer in Baltimore. You can put in a proposal by tonight. The deadline is midnight Hawaii time, so maybe into Monday. But that's an audience that's really hungry for smart people filling in the rest of the picture. A lot of these people are very new to computer science. Like they just signed up to be a computer science teacher possibly like last month, and now they're in the gauntlet and they have to kind of put some stuff in there. And I think they're really looking for a mission-driven work, that they want to feel like what they're doing is important and it's beyond just jobs. It's got morals and ethics in it. So I think it'd be great to have a sophisticated crowd there to kind of engage with the rest of the country.
Speaking of plugs, can I plug that so the CS for All in the city has a request for proposal out now for workshops of all types, definitely around networks. I believe, I don't know when the deadline is, but it's, there you go, she knows. Offering support, paying for your workshop, paying the teachers, so.
And these are workshops to teach teachers?
Yeah,
correct?
workshops to teach teachers, not to teach students.
Yeah, so it would be getting things for teaching stuff
Yeah,
into schools.
but they will teach students.
Okay. So that was, I mean, thanks guys
Yeah,
for coming, and I realized this was like a very low-key thing, but I'm really pleased, like I'm happy that you guys showed up. Like it's hard to know if there's going to be anyone else excited.
Can I put in one more plug?
Yes.
Which is to say, for me, one of the most valuable ways I've managed to keep learning in any area I'm working at is small conferences, less than 100 people, and small workshops. And some of the ones that are most valuable to me today are ones that at the beginning I wasn't sure if I was going to keep attending. So regardless of what you're feeling about Radical Network, what you're feeling, keep coming back, because it gets more valuable the more you do it. And it's been interesting watching it just grow the last couple of years. I think it's going to keep growing, so keep doing it.
Thanks.
Yay.
Thank you for coming.
That's a vacation. See,
Okay, a little bit
We got a cigarette? Yeah. I'll get my jacket.
Let's say it's we're talking about the way that a lot of
Yeah, we.
And it's, you know,
Yeah, yeah.